We've got guests today. As you all know, MLS camps set up, open. Even Lionel Messi scored a goal this past weekend in preseason up against Club America. Inter Miami won their season opening preseason match. So all is right in the world of football. So let's head to Miami. As you just heard, the aforementioned David Gass from the SoccerWise podcast joins us. Welcome to the show, David. First of all, since old Leo got his Presidential Medal of Freedom, has he changed as a person?
I'll tell you this, and I'm not saying I'm a sleeper agent or I work for anyone, but since I've arrived in Miami, he's won 0 trophies. So he can beat most defenders, but there's something about my aura or something about my energy that's just maybe undefeated.
That's good. It's good for the league, I think. You don't want a dynasty forming under Lionel Messi, right? That's bad for the league.
Absolutely.
So told. But listen, it's exciting season ahead of us. It's wide open. The primary transfer window opens January 31st, and that means basically international deals can be made official. Roster compliance is February 21st, and as of right now, players can finally be bought and sold for cash deals within MLS, aligning finally with world football and their system. I guess that's exciting, talking about transfer systems, but do you sense this will result in more deals and a frantic few weeks ahead of February 21st?
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like there's the perfect timing for this rule to come into effect. So the fact that for the first time ever, you can really acquire a big-time player in Major League Soccer through the league. Up until this year, and for example, in December, I texted friends who worked at clubs and said, hey, would you ever go get Evander, who had said, I don't want to be in Portland anymore, but didn't say he didn't want to play in Major League Soccer. And everyone said enough GAM or TAM doesn't exist. Like the max teams really hold is anywhere between 3 and 5 million. And Evander was bought for $12 million. Like you couldn't put it together. And there wasn't a trade that you could put together. It feels very likely now that Evander is going to stay in Major League Soccer because now with this rule coming into effect, teams have enough money to be able to go out and buy him just like you would do outside of the United States. And I think there's a ton of value in that. One of the big things you hear over and over and over and over again from players who come into this league and coaches who come into this league is how unique the setup is, the travel, the atmospheres, the environments, the turf, all the stadiums. So to spend $12 million on a known quantity versus an unknown quantity, I think has a lot of value in Major League Soccer. There are owners who want to spend in a level that other owners can't or don't want to spend. It's been a constant fight inside the league. And so this has the opportunity to open things up, and it feels like a really good first year for it to happen, to have 2 star players in Evander and Lucho both saying they don't want to be at their teams anymore, but neither fully saying they don't want to play in Major League Soccer.
Player power. Nice. Entering MLS like a real league.
Yeah.
Do you think in the not so distant future we'll see cash deals become more popular than trades within MLS?
That's going to depend on the salary cap, because I think the value in the other trade stuff is this fake money means more to teams than real money sometimes because of the way they can buy players into their salary cap and expand things and all that type of stuff. So I don't know that it'll outpace it, but I think it'll have a really interesting space because you can do 2 a year, both in and out per team. I think not only with the star players, I think we're going to start to see it with young players. And we saw it in Toronto. The first U22 signing was Ayo Akinola. Like teams are constantly trying to find ways to figure out how to make their academy system sort of similar to what we see around the world. Like it has to have overt value over just, oh, this is a young player or a local player, like come root for them. And so homegrowns affect the cap differently. And homegrowns also are trying to figure out their career. So I think that will be one mechanism where this is really popular, is Nashville generates a good young homegrown player who wants to take the next step. Maybe for that player, the next step's LAFC before it's Club Brugge. And so that's a way for this to be used. And then the flip side will be on these star players. Everyone else in between, I think, will still be these trades of whatever, allocation money, international roster spot, draft pick, X player, all those types of things. I think that will be the case for a little while, as long as the salary cap still sits similar to where it sits right now.
Do you think the league will...
Go ahead, Jimmy.
Do you think the league will have a say in valuation of players?
It's a good question.
We've seen it before, like in England, where They want to get rid of a player, but they don't want to sell them in the Premier League or in a domestic league. They want them to go abroad. So how do you think that's going to work here in MLS, where you don't really want to sell a top player to competition?
That's an interesting point of view. The other side of it is MLS has almost been built to make sure its teams don't compete for the same players. AKA, they don't want their teams to outbid each other. Like, that's the whole point of discovery rights, is that two teams can't say, we want Wilfred Zaha. Well, we'll give him $8 million. Well, we'll give $10 million. We'll give 12. Like, MLS built a structure to avoid that. This now potentially opens up their structure. Now, the money stays internally, so maybe they don't care. Maybe they don't care if Evander gets bought for $25 million because the Portland Timbers get that. So I think that's one side of things, but you are right in the other side, which is, I think a huge part of this is to keep talent inside the league. Like, MLS would be a worse league next year if Lucho Acosta and Evander, or this year, if Lucho Acosta and Evander didn't play in Major League Soccer, because they're both proven quantities of good players that fans want to come watch and are able to keep the game flowing and keep the game competitive. So I think there's a stake for the league to keep them inside. And I do wonder if you get into a spot where Cruz Azul offers 10 million and Orlando offers 9.5, and MLS sort of nudge, wings. Hey, can we make this work? Whether that's talking to Orlando to up it a little or talking to Portland to sort of accept it and find different ways and mechanisms to make it worth the value. I think there'll be that conversation. And I would be surprised if players got sold like inside conference for now. The rumors we're hearing about the two guys I'm talking about, they are both cross conference. I don't think that's a coincidence that the Portland Timbers are like, Orlando's basically another country. So like, we'll just send him there, but nothing too familiar.
Do you get the feeling that this is well received by the players and the ownership across the league? Is this something that everybody was pushing for, these changes?
I know the front offices were. The front offices want more mechanisms to be able to operate like a normal soccer team and make it easier for them to move players and sort of add to their rosters. And I think a lot of the front offices have the ears of their owners who want that as well. And that's kind of been the fight in Major League Soccer over the last few years. And Paul Tenorio and Sam Stejsko, when he was working at the Athletic, covered it a ton of like, there's the pushers in the league, the Arthur Blanks of the world, the Jorge Masses who want to spend more and push. And there's the other side of the league, which was in Vancouver. I don't know what Vancouver will look like now going forward. I think some of the Pacific Northwest teams as well, on top of that, are like, well, let's keep things steady because their markets are not as big as the other one. So I think you're seeing, from what I've had conversations, it fall along those fault lines for the most part. I haven't talked to a front office that isn't happy about this. So they all love the more flexibility, the opportunity. Even the ones that are smaller love the idea that they can sell to other teams in MLS and make money and generate money in this way. So for the most part, on the competitive side, it's been met pretty evenly. For the players, I think I'm sure you all have talked to enough MLS players. There's a lack of trust often between MLS players and Major League Soccer. And that always falls in all of this of, well, how is this rule going to be used? Is it really going to help us? But I think in general, there's an overwhelming feeling of this is one of the first steps towards some level of normalization of the rules and demystification, and everyone's in favor of that.
So that's within the league, David, and whether it's from a player perspective or an owner perspective. But what do you think the rule changes do to sort of advance the league and the global football standing, and what other people, whether it's players, owners, investors worldwide, think of MLS?
I think it's a positive. I think it puts MLS teams in a stronger position against those teams. You've seen there's a handful of teams around the world who sort of understand MLS rules, and they get deals all the time. The one me and Tom always joke about on our show is Fortaleza, run by the former head of scouting at San Jose. They picked off Gregory knowing Miami needed to get rid of a DP, and there was nowhere else for them to turn. They are consistently in conversations for other MLS players. Our joke has been like Carlos Carrizo is going to end up there because San Jose's tapped out on DPs and need to get rid of one. And you sort of look around the world, and Tim Bezbachenko now runs the setup with Bournemouth, and the guy who owns Botafogo and Crystal Palace gets it as well. And like, they often pick off pieces from MLS knowing the rules. So I think this is a positive because it gives a little bit more negotiating space for an MLS team to say, well, we could sell him to Cincinnati, so we don't have to sell to you. It's like, you have to come to us with a fair offer. I think that's a positive. I think for the rest of the world, though, I don't think it makes it easier to bring in MLS players, it might raise their valuation because, like I talked about on the homegrown side, for very long, it's like, oh, we'll give you sort of nothing for that homegrown player. We'll give you $500,000 and a sell-on fee. And like, that's kind of the best you could do. If a team now has already bought that player for $1 million inside of MLS, that raises their valuation. And I think international teams will meet that because I think international teams are committed to the talent that's in this region and what it can be for them, but they haven't been pushed to raise those numbers because no one else is pushing them to do it. And so I think for MLS to do it internally could be a really big positive for them.
We're talking about cash transfer fees now, but what about the GAM now? So like the artificial, this made up money not expiring. That's like the league sort of doubling down on like this mystical aspect of the league that continues to be, something that is a little bit esoteric to the rest of the world. And now they're like, this made up money will not expire, right? So they're clinging to that a little bit.
Carrot and stick, and you can't just burn the Monopoly board when you're done playing. Like after your grandparents cheat, you don't just get to throw it in the garbage and start over. You still have to continue to play. It is, for starters, it's a huge positive for teams because, for example, FC Dallas sold Alan Velasco. The money they got in allocation from him had a time limit on it, which meant other teams in MLS could say like, well, we know you have to spend this. So you can't just like wait on it, which means if you come to us for our player, you've got 12 months to get this done. So like we have the power in this. So it's great for MLS teams. It's great for selling teams, which I think a lot of us want most MLS teams to be. Like if you accept the reality of where you sit in the global hierarchy, you're going to have to sell players at some point to someone. The Club Americas of the world, the top 5 in Europe, the big teams in Brazil, like those are just bigger teams, accept that. But if you do it, then now there's not this like fake clock chasing you to use that money. And often we've seen teams use it poorly. And we've seen teams where it felt like they were going in the right direction, all of a sudden make 3 buys that make no sense, that don't fit the timeline of what they've said they've created. And all of a sudden that team's going in the opposite direction. So to have it go away is really good. To have it continue to be part of the conversation is slightly frustrating. And I can understand that from a lot of people. I do think we're on the right road in this whole process, as I said, of like starting to get rid of some of this. Because if you put it in a situation where it at least lasts forever, the idea that one day it just becomes money, like, okay, when this rule goes away, you can't turn to a team that has it and say, oh, you don't have that anymore. The assumption will be that then on that day, the league will say, all right, we're going to convert that into $4 million in actual cash that the league will hand out somehow, whatever. And the team will have that money to spend until it's gone. And then from there on, it'll just be money. And like, they'll just be a soccer team that has money that comes in and money goes out. That's the hope. So at least you're getting into a place where something like that is possible. And that at least sets some of the mechanisms in place to become just a normal sports league.
So you think within 5 years it will be typical football free market business? No more GAM, no more TAM. Is that too soon, the timeline?
If you asked me to put a timeline on any of this, I would delay as much as humanly possible. The World Cup's coming on the men's side in 1 year. We all thought like there'd be flying cars and we'd be eating Jetsons food by now in terms of MLS rules, and almost none of that is true. So if my guess will be that the league will hold on to this structure as long as humanly possible. How long that is, I'm not sure. I think expansion changes it. It seems for the most part like each new expansion team brings an owner that doesn't really want it and maybe isn't steeped in like the way these rules are set up. But the league is a money loser for most owners. And so it's like this long-term play. It's this long-term investment belief that it'll turn a profit in 65 years and they'll pass it on to their kids and whatever. So they're in no rush, is what it feels like from the outside, to push spending and change spending styles and limits and all of those things. At least most especially from the owners who are really founder owners and the ones who have been through 30 years or 15 years and have lost money for all of that time. I don't know that has to be the case. Like you could convince me pretty easily that if you flipped all of this on its head and went and became the new Saudi Arabia and brought in all these stars and big players and all that stuff, that MLS could make money because it's the United States and Canada and people like sports and like the buildings are built and there's all this positive momentum to a lot of it. So I don't know. If you push me on the 5 years, I'd probably take the over on that and hope that my bet, lands in 6 years when you owe me.
Your return will be in GAM.
Yeah, thank you. But I could go out and buy all the players in MLS that still operate under the system.
But it's still a cap league regardless. And obviously there's only so much you can spend, although there's creative ways to get around that. We know that. But will this encourage more of a tiered league, the haves and the have-nots, do you think?
I don't know that this, to me, totally opens that up, because I do think with the money staying inside the league, might even some things out. It might create a situation where Colorado is actually better off because they can sell a player to another team inside of MLS that has more value to them, right? Rafa Navarro, if he gets sold eventually to the New York Red Bulls, because they just, well, I don't know why I picked that team. That's a bad one. If he gets sold to Atlanta, because Atlanta, their number 9 from overseas doesn't work out, and they're like, we're in win now mode. We know this guy can win in MLS. He probably has more value to them than he does to a team overseas who they're not sure how an MLS player comes to their team and settles in. So in that scenario, Colorado's probably better off than they were. Then they can go back and reinvest that money and be able to be more competitive. So I think that what this does is it allows more ways for teams to be different. And in a salary cap league, I think the difference is what allows teams to be competitive. Like what we've seen over the last 10 years is the Philadelphias of the world, and even the Red Bulls of the world, as much as people will make fun of them, they can be competitive in their own way, in their own lane that they're fully committed to. And I think when you have more rules set up the way MLS does, it allows avenues for different clubs to pick different lanes. And when you do that, if you're fully committed to it, you can normally continue to be competitive because you're so different. The problem is when a team tries to emulate a team that's bigger or higher spending. So when a team looks at LAFC and says, oh, we'll go out and we'll get a mid-tier Mexican international winger, and we'll go out and we'll get an old French center forward, and we'll be competitive like LAFC, but they don't do it at the level of Vela and Giroud and Bouanga, and then they struggle. I think this allows another way for teams to be different. And saying all of what I just said to answer the previous question, Stan Kroenke's like the 5th most wealthy owner in the league, and they're the cheap team. So I still don't know that stuff's going anywhere.
I saw a great picture actually yesterday. Calgary's Cavalry are training in LA right now, and there's a picture of Calgary training, and there's Olivier Giroud in the background. And it's like, wow, CPL's coming along slowly but surely, it appears. But so we're entering the free market, call it what you want in transfer terms. There's conversations at the head office about potentially switching the league season to more of a winter, fall, spring season. Is that an acknowledgement that MLS has realized, okay, let's join the party as opposed to let's invite everyone to our party and they'll see right? Is it changing that way, do you think?
I would say, for starters, I don't think it was trying to get everyone else to change. I think it was sort of like we're doing a different thing. Mm-hmm. Like your international soccer is what it is. And like, we're not trying to enter that. We're trying to create this American soccer experience that lives on our own timeline and does our own thing. Like, I think that was the original issue, was you get all the way into 2016 and 18, and all of a sudden Don Garber's like, we're a selling league, which came out of nowhere in terms of, it was just never a conversation of how MLS fit into the global soccer structure. I think for the people who organized the league for such a long time, I do think it's moving further away from that because you are starting to become part of the global market. And that's like a huge concern for a lot of teams, is that they get stuck in bad places where their off season aligns with the January transfer window, which is for the most part marked up. It is interesting in that on this side of the world, that's not the case with the calendar. And so I think it's an acknowledgement that MLS wants to be connected more to European soccer than any global soccer. Because that's the thing, right? Like, people are like, well, MLS has playoffs. Playoffs don't exist. It's like, playoffs exist in Mexico and Costa Rica and Colombia. It's like, playoffs exist. You just only watch 5 leagues in the world or 4 leagues and call one a farmers league. And like, that's the only structure you want to talk about. I do think it's an acknowledgement that MLS is moving closer to that. I also think the World Cup is just this unique thing, which is you can't play a domestic soccer league during the World Cup. So like, you've got a 2-month blackout coming next year that you can't get around. And if you're ever going to just on a lark try a thing with a pro sports league and just shift the calendar all of a sudden, that's your year to do it. And so I think it's a combination of the two. I still don't understand where you play half these games for half the year. Like, I was just with a friend who worked at Minnesota who still has their hand warmers from when the U.S. played a World Cup qualifier in February there. And Matt Turner got frostbite and was out for 5 months. So I don't know where half these teams play, but I do think that's your like sort of one get out of jail free card. Man, I'm all on my Monopoly. I haven't played the game in like 30 years.
Do not collect $200.
Yeah. I do think you get that one chance with the World Cup. And my hope would be, because I think there should be the case about a lot of stuff around the World Cup. My hope would be that the league looks at it and says like, okay, this is our one chance to sort of try something like this.
And what about Leagues Cup? Have you heard any whispers about, the alleged kind of reshuffling of that, and rather than make it like a month-long stop, that is sort of sprinkled throughout the season?
I've only heard the stuff that's been put public, which seems to be there's going to be a gap between who plays in all the different competitions. So teams I don't think are going to play in all three when it comes to Open Cup, Champions Cup, and Leagues Cup. Canadian Championship didn't seem to be a problem. So teams had already played in two at a minimum. And I do think the like breaking point for the Mexican clubs of like, we don't want to go live in the US for 6 weeks and play in this competition has come. So it sounds like it'll be less teams playing in midweeks, sort of like a Champions League setup, so that there's less of a break and less of a gap. Whether those are home and away in Mexico is very unclear still, because the huge driving point for Mexican clubs in Leagues Cup was they want to sell to their American-based audiences. They want to grow their American-based audiences. So Toluca doesn't really want to win. That's not like the biggest thing when it's organized. The biggest thing for them is they would like to sell to fans in Cincinnati and Nashville and in Denver and in San Francisco. So hosting games doesn't really do that for you. So my guess would be what it ends up being is it's probably about 18 MLS clubs to match 18 Liga MX clubs. And everyone plays against the other league to start in an either home and away or single elimination competition in the MLS stadiums. And then you just move from there into a knockout.
We're going to see more and more of Liga MX, MLS merger type things over the next few years. What's a big play here? Like let's and then I said before, 5 years from now, let's go 10 years from now, let's go 20 years from now. Where are we at?
If I had to guess, I would say at some point we get a European Super League, which opens up the door to having competitions combined, and you get a Liga MX MLS combination league. I think the two leagues have the one thing the other one wants. MLS has organization. Like Liga MX, they just had this whole buy-in, buy-out thing with the NFL. Liga MX wants to be organized. They want to be functional. There's so much inefficiency that goes on that they lose so much, whether it's fans or resources, whatever it is. And MLS wants passion and history, and Liga MX has that. And so the two leagues are really like a clean fit for each other. Geography is an issue on that, but I think that starts to open up a little bit as it becomes more normalized for a team in England to play a team in Naples, every other week and that type of stuff. I think it's kind of right in line behind a lot of that. And so if my guess would be in 20 years when all of this changes and the FIFA rules shift and, La Liga's hosting home games in Miami and all these leagues are all combined and all that type of stuff, that's the future for an MLS Liga MX. The dream scenario for me is you have sort of like Apertura Clausura, and the Apertura is leagues playing inside of each other, and then the Clausura you qualify into. So you have a situation where the top 10 teams in MLS play the top 10 teams in Liga MX in the Clausura for a championship, and the other teams maybe play internally for a league for like a secondary trophy and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of fun stuff you can do. I'm someone who grew up on Liga MX. Like that was for me just accessibility of like what was on TV and what had fans and looked fun. Like that was the league I grew up on. And so I've always measured MLS to that because of that point. Like that to me was the sign of a successful league in the Americas. And MLS was always starting to grow with that. And it's taken, I think, huge steps. And the feeling when you go to Mexico or when you talk to fans from Mexico is acknowledgement of like, oh yeah, MLS is competitive. Like I remember when I went to the 2017 CCL final when Toronto played in Guadalajara, they only talked about Giovinco. It was like acceptable that Giovinco was good enough to compete. It wasn't acceptable that an MLS team was good enough to compete. That's not the case anymore. LAFC is a Liga MX club. San Diego is going to be a Liga MX. Like, in their minds, those teams are equal to the teams they watch. Those players are the same players. And you see it in the movement of players. You see it in Brandon Vasquez going down and coming back. And Cruz Azul now is just shopping in Major League Soccer. So the perception has shifted to a level where I think it would be really acceptable to both fan bases to say those teams are equal to my teams, and those teams are teams we play against and we compete against and we measure ourselves against all the time.
Do you think the Chivas idea would have worked if it was a few years later than when they did try it, as far as the connection?
Having only players from one country?
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Never going to work.
No.
Silly idea.
Yes, most likely. Seemed like the worst case scenario of what to choose.
Yeah, I guess we're growing up. We're learning over here all the time. I hope we do see that Super League ahead of a European Super League, but I think you're right. That's inevitable as well at some point. Neymar, was that just a cruel hoax to get all MLS and Chicago fans all giddy as he leverages a move back to Brazil, or was there more to it than that? Do you think?
I think it was a real conversation that, like, if he was gonna leave, these are the places he'd go. So, like, have the convo with each of them and then make your decision at the end. There's clearly leverage in all of that. Like, you need Santos to up the bid. You need Saudi Arabia to believe that the potential is out there to open the door to a sale. And then when Chicago walks away because it's not possible and Santos is left there and saying, this is all we have left, you can, as Neymar, turn to your club and say, like, well, you already acknowledged it's okay for me to leave. I think all of that is mixed in, but I think part of it's real. Like, a lot of his brand partnerships are American companies, and he's done a lot in the US. And it's obviously a next hurdle for a lot of players and a lot of people. You see what Messi's doing, and the World Cup's coming here. So I don't think it's a coincidence of the timing. Like, if he's going to play here and be based here and not have to travel as much and all those things, these are the 2 years to do it. And at his career point, these are probably it was the last chance for him to do it. So I think a level of that was real. But I don't know that he is the right move. So maybe Chicago got out a little bit lucky, and a guy who's like always unhealthy to play and all of the things he does, but then shows up on the field for Brazil. Maybe it was a good thing in the end. If Chicago doesn't end up getting there, and we still don't know. Like, Chicago maybe finds a way back into it, but I think it's a good moment for Chicago to acknowledge, like, this is who they could be. They could be a Miami. There's no reason they can't. They have the owner, they have the city, they have the market. And so at least being fake in this is a positive first step for them to being potentially real in a move like this in the future.
David, I'd like to get your thoughts on the Vancouver Whitecaps and what's going on there. They're up for sale. What are your feelings on what's going to happen with them long term? Yes, Amy? Did you?
Sorry, I have to go. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was trying to do everything but lovely to have you. Bye-bye.
Nice to see you again.
Thanks, Dubs.
Nice to see you too.
Vancouver, I think it's unfortunate. I think the fan base has shown over the last 3 years, when the team's semi-competitive, that they care, that they're engaged, that, like, it matters. The academy's done so well against all odds at some points, not just Alphonso Davies. Like, it's a club. I go and cover the youth ranks. They are competitive at youth tournaments with all the other MLS teams, with international clubs. And you often go to the field and they're like, oh, we just got this group 6 months ago because we can't operate before they're 14. And we can't play as many international teams coming through COVID because we couldn't leave the country and all these things. I think there's a lot of positives around it. You end up getting down to, like, how many rich people are there in an area? How many people can afford to buy this thing that live there? And what we saw with Anthony Precourt in Columbus is, if you're not from there, it's kind of dangerous to have an owner to come in and say, like, oh yeah, I'm super committed to this community I have no part of. And I'm also a billionaire because I've done all these shrewd moves to make money. And don't worry, like, trust me on this. So I think it's a worrying time for Vancouver fans. I think it's fair to be worried. Mm-hmm. I think the Vancouver Whitecaps have a history and, like, a legacy that seems worth keeping. And if I was a sports owner, I would consider that, because you're starting to run out of markets that make sense. And I don't know what the next one is. If you're going to move the Vancouver Whitecaps, is it Phoenix? Is it Las Vegas? Like, you have to build a giant indoor stadium for those two markets because of the weather and what you're set up there. And if it's not those two, I don't know what market looks better than Vancouver. And so I would hope that it would get a new owner and stay in place and continue to be competitive. And, like, I think what we've seen from MLS clubs in the past, RSL got sold and immediately gets to the top 3 in the Western Conference after spending 4 or 5 years battling around the 6-7 seed. It's not that hard. And when that happens, you sell out the stadium and people like it. It seems like there's a simple road for them to be competitive and semi-profitable and like relevant in their market and all of that. But I would, if I was a fan of the team, I'd be really worried right now.
And wouldn't you think MLS would rather pick up another expansion fee if they're plunking a team in a new market in the States rather than relocating an established team in Canada?
And then you'd have a situation, I think, where if the team got sold, you have to find a way to reallocate some of those funds, because when an expansion team's bought, the money goes to the other owners. So if you buy the Vancouver Whitecaps, they still have to probably find a way to find the 20, 30 million that goes to the other teams from somewhere, because you're probably losing out on expansion. Like, you're not going to drop an expansion team into Vancouver 2 years after you move the Whitecaps. So in that situation, you're probably telling the buyer, oh, you think it's 300 million? No, it's actually 600 million. And 300 of that is going to be reallocated to the other owners who want their money from the expansion bid they thought was coming to get the next team that plays in Vegas or Detroit or whatever it is. So that probably complicates things as well for potential owner sitting in that situation saying, well, I know what the asset's valued at. Why am I being pushed to do this thing? I think all of that, your hope would be, makes it harder. And therefore you end up in a spot, where the ownership of the league says, well, we'd rather have another team and move it. Now, the league did pretty well in finding the Haslams to buy Columbus and sort of move the team to Austin. Like, that was a whole mess. I think ended up as good as you could hope once it started. But I do think there was a lot of learnings from the league in the way the structure of Anthony Precourt's contract was that he bought into. So I don't think it'll happen again where like the owner says they're not going to move the team, and then all of a sudden 2.5 years in, they find a mechanism to move it, because I think that's all been stricken out. But I do think there are other mechanisms that the league is working on to potentially move teams. And that's the danger, is like if it's done above board, just at a really high number.
But there's a chance, Vancouver fans, you heard that. There's a chance that they'll stay where they are.
I mean,
let's hope.
I don't have the money in my bank account, so I can't help, but I would love to.
I'm sure Tom does. Just ask Tom. He'll take care of it for you.
I'll pull it out of the mustache.
Hey, David, tell us about SoccerWise, can you?
Yeah.
And where people can find it.
Yeah, we try and live broadcast as much as we can on YouTube and Twitch 3 times a week. But otherwise, you can find us as a podcast. Just search SoccerWise, and any of your social media is SoccerWise HQ. And it's myself, Tom Bogert, and Jordan Angeli covering, for the most part, MLS and NWSL pretty much every day of the week, trying to cover these leagues as we believe they should be and we think fans deserve, and trying to be a place for fans to come and scream and yell and ask questions and sort of have the conversations that, for the most part, NFL fans get to have and EPL fans get to have. But it feels like for a long time, and I know you guys are working on something similar, feels like people in our region didn't get to do that and didn't really get to acknowledge it. And for a lot of us, it's hard to find people in person to talk about these things. So to have the online community is really huge. We've got a huge Discord that we have that people can go in and talk, all different channels. We've got a Canada channel, USMNT channel. We've got MLS, USL, NWSL, all these types of things for people to sit around and talk about on match nights or throughout the week when rumors come out, all those types of things. And then we've got the podcast that we try and put out at least 4 or 5 times a week, have interviews with interesting conversations around the sport. We've got referees this week. We've got an immigration lawyer next week to talk about visas and how players get into the leagues and sort of their experience and process behind the scenes. We talk to coaches and scouts and players and all those types of things. And then just us talking about the game, myself and Tom on MLS, and Jordan Angeli, who is one of the best broadcasters in NWSL on the NWSL side. So it's been really fun. We just started in July of last year, maybe June. So we're getting during our first full year, and we're working on our season previews and all of our plans for the year. So if you want more soccer, feel free to come and join us.
SoccerWise, absolutely, yeah, it's fantastic. You know, it's funny, when we started out doing this a few years ago now, it was very European, specifically Premier League heavy. And for a long time in Canada, that was where people wanted to get consume their football, European, EPL in particular. As we've evolved, we've kind of pivoted to covering it from way more of a Canadian angle, covering a lot more domestic football, MLS, national team. And our numbers speaks for themselves. You know, we do an EPL video now. No one's watching that. We do an MLS video. You know, it's fantastic. It's changed. We've hit that tipping point, I think, over here.
Do you think it's the national team that's driven it, or do you think it's the clubs?
It's a big part of it. I would say, guys, it began in that 2022, didn't it? Really, when our numbers began to really increase. So it's interesting how the game has really evolved and matured over here in North America.
Yeah.
And there's a Eurocentrics out there, of course. And we love our Premier League. We love our Serie A. Don't get me wrong. We still talk about it. But there's a lot of fans who watch North American football over European football. And it's only going to get more and more that way, I think. So we're onto something, I think, David, all of us. If we stick with it.
We 2 weeks ago, the media marketing tour was in Miami. So I had a chance to sit with Jesse for a little. And then last week I interviewed Casey Stoney, as I know you did as well. There's a lot of jealousy on this side of the border right now about national team setup. So it should feel pretty good for Canada fans. There's jealousy in a lot of ways at times. But this one is really big. It seems like just listening to Casey Stoney off the back of Jesse Marsh and sort of the similarities that they have of the view of how they see their job and what they can do. It's pretty exciting. That's where I had Amy on last week to talk about it. And it's like, the platform that's been built on the women's national team that Casey Stoney thinks she can build on is awesome. And I don't know, watching a Jesse Marsh team run into a wall at 110 miles per hour will never stop entertaining me. And I would always wear the jersey that represented that.
Yeah, you know what? Despite the last number of years, and despite the financial problems we still have over here in Canada, the fact that they found a way to afford the Jesse Marshes and Stoneys of the world says a lot, I think, about this new leadership in Canadian soccer, that they're creative. They have to be. We haven't got the money. We haven't got a camp in January, for example. I know you guys do down there. So it's a work in progress, but I think we're taking the right strides. David, thank you so much for this. Really enjoyed that. I think I've got a much better understanding, actually, of the new system now. So I'll be sure to keep listening to SoccerWise. And thanks so much. You're welcome back anytime.
I would love to do it. So I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
It's David Gass from SoccerWise. This has been Footy Prime. We are back tomorrow with, I'm not sure with whom or talking about what, but it'll be well worth your listen. Keep liking, subscribing, following. Leave us some comments, and we'll see you then. Cheers for listening. David, thank you, mate. That was really good.
Yeah. Anytime.
I think you may have done a couple of podcasts before, haven't you?
Yeah, maybe one.